Good morning and welcome to Social Impact Training Webinar 3. Today we're going to be looking at your stakeholders and also starting to think about what data we need to collect. So in terms of where we're at, obviously Webinar 3, and we're going to start off by, in terms of looking at the key steps. If we look at the process, then this session is about the ones that are highlighted in red. So, excuse me, identifying your stakeholders, how you're going to involve your stakeholders in the social impact reporting, and then starting to think about this impact mapping. And then once you've done your impact mapping, looking at what data you've got in place already, so that you can then start to do the data collection for any bits of data that are missing if you haven't got the data that you need in order to measure that you've achieved the outcomes that you desire. So in terms of our stakeholders, stakeholders are people that have an effect on the organisation or people that we have an effect on as an organisation. So it's a two-way process, and this is the typical way that you would map your stakeholders. So just get a piece of paper, put your organisation's name in the middle, and then draw lines out to all of the stakeholders that you have an effect on or that have an effect on you. And what you can do is the ones that are more important or have more effect on you, or you're more closely connected to, you can put closer to your organisation in the centre. And that's one way that you can identify who your key stakeholders are. So obviously, usually the stakeholders include your trustees, your staff, the customers, beneficiaries, clients, whatever you want to call them, possibly volunteers if you have them, maybe key funders, and maybe key partner organisations. There may also be particular people within government departments or officials. You could say one of your stakeholders is a neighbourhood or a community locally. So there could be all kinds of stakeholders that you need to consider. And also it may be that you have different stakeholders for different services or activities that you do as well. And what you ideally want to do is for each of the services or activities that you've decided to include in your social impact report. So from last week's webinar, where we talked about what the scope of your report would be, you're now thinking about, well, who are those key stakeholders? And then once you've identified them, ideally you want to be looking at the outcomes that are important for each of those key stakeholder groups. Usually for your first social impact report, I don't recommend that you do more than 3 to 4 stakeholder groups unless you've already got all of the data from them in place already, because otherwise it's going to become too onerous in terms of the amount of data that you've got to collect, and it will take up too much of your time. And one of the things that I said at the beginning is that you want to make your social impact reporting a manageable process that can be done within your organisation without taking a lot of your time and resources up. So ideally go for 3 to 4, unless you felt that you definitely had to include another stakeholder, in which case you may go up to about 5. But what you would do if you've got lots of stakeholders is in your next year's social impact report, you'd consult with some of the other stakeholders. So potentially over a 3 to 5 year period, you'd consult with all of your stakeholder groups. But the first year is really about picking out the key ones that you have to include and consult with this year. Once you've identified those key stakeholder groups, then what you've got to start thinking about is the outcomes that are important for each of those stakeholder groups. And now, quite often what happens is, as an organisation, we assume what the outcomes are that we're achieving for people. So from your perspective, you may be saying, well, our outcomes are about people being able to live independently. Our outcomes are about educating people, getting people into work, building confidence, whatever it is that you consider to be the key outcomes. But each of your stakeholder groups will have a different perspective on what those key outcomes are. So if you were to talk to some of the clients that you work with, one of the key outcomes for them may be that they're now more aware of their choices and options, they're socialising more, they've got more confidence, they're more motivated, which could potentially be a different outcome to the one that you as an organisation are trying to achieve. So what you need to do is make sure that you have consulted with each of your different stakeholder groups to understand what outcomes they are looking for, because they're not necessarily going to be the same as what you want. And also, where you're working in partnership with other organisations or you've got funding, then they're potentially looking for different outcomes as well to what you want to achieve. Okay, so once you understand what each of the outcomes are for your different stakeholders, and it may be that you don't at this stage understand what they are, and when we come to look at the data collection, you'll have the opportunity to decide, well, what are the missing bits of data that we need to collect? And it may be that one of the missing bits of data is finding out what are those outcomes for each of those different stakeholder groups. So what you'd need to do is do your data collection almost in two stages. One is where you consult with a few of each of those key stakeholder groups to identify what the key outcomes are for them, and then do the wider consulting with that stakeholder group once you've got a clearer idea of the types of outcomes that they're interested in. So as part of your data collection systems, and really the idea behind the data collection systems is that you're collecting the data on an ongoing basis, so that you're not having to go back and get the data after you've delivered a project or months later. So this is really about embedding the data collection systems within your organisation so that you can say, well, we're collecting the data all the time, we don't need to worry about this at the end of the year, because we'll have the data and the evidence that we need. So part of the process of getting your data collection right is to have these indicators. So all an indicator is a way that you know that an outcome has been achieved. So if you deliver an outcome, if you deliver an activity, then it achieves a particular outcome. How do you know that that outcome has been achieved? Really is really all that an indicator is showing you. So the key thing then with your data collection is really about knowing where your client group are starting from, and also what the end result is. So that before and after data collection are really important, because if you said, well, your outcome is that people now volunteer, if you didn't collect any data at the beginning when they first got in touch with you, then you won't know whether they were already volunteering or whether it is definitely an outcome that you've achieved that they're now volunteering. So you need to get the before and after picture in order to have an indicator that outcome's actually been achieved. What I want to just show you is on one of the websites that's available for anyone to access is some indicators that can be used in order to identify that particular outcomes have been achieved. And this website is really good. Let's have a look and get up. on the page. Right, so on your social indicators here, on the provenimprove.org website, in the measuring impact section, what they've got is a whole section around indicators, and then they give you some examples of indicators that you can use for social changes, so the differences that you make to people. And one of the key things that organisations are nowadays saying is that they improve people's well-being, and well-being has always been quite a difficult outcome to measure, because it has so many different components. But what this web page shows you is the different aspects and the different elements that you could potentially incorporate into well-being. So I like the stuff that NEF has done, New Economics Foundation, around well-being, because they have said that well-being is made up of these two elements, which is people's satisfaction with their lives and their sense of personal development. So this is their positive functioning or personal expressiveness, and also their social well-being in terms of how much they feel they belong to a community, etc. So it's made up of three different elements, and if you wanted then to measure well-being, that it would be necessary to include indicators for all three of those elements if you choose to take the definition that NEF has got of well-being. It may be that you decide you've got another alternative definition of what well-being is that you want to measure, but the key bit, if I just move down a little bit, is this bit around where they've shown that the key factors for promoting well-being at work are personal control of workload, work matched to skill level, variety of content, role clarity, etc., etc. So if you wanted to see, it was saying where you were improving people's well-being at work, then these are some of the things that you would want to include in your data collection systems. And rightly, as they say, usually it's done on a scale where you get the individuals to score how they feel about these particular elements on a scale of 0 to 10. And that then gives you an indication of how they're improving in terms of that particular indicator. And obviously you would need to collect this survey data at least 2 points. Typically what happens if you do collect this kind of data is that people may score themselves quite low or negatively when they do the first initial survey, and then what you find on the second survey, which perhaps is a midpoint, they may score themselves even worse. So it will look as if you haven't achieved anything, but this is primarily due to them having more self-awareness of and actually recognising where they are as a person. And perhaps when they first came to you, they didn't fully understand where they were at and what their particular issues were. And then when you do the third survey, so towards the end of the programme of support or later on, then you should find that the scores have increased again. So that then gives you your positive change. But they've got on here some quite good sample questions. The other place, if you are looking for sample questions, is obviously go to the NEF, the New Economic Foundation's website, and they've got reports around wellbeing where they include the questions. So things like this, how satisfied are you with your relationships with your family? How satisfied are you with your paid work or job? Etc. So there's loads and loads of questions on here, all asking people around those particular things. Then there's another bit around skill development. So if you're trying to develop people's skills, then there's all kinds of indicators that you could use. Then there's health indicators. So lots of stuff on here that's really good. And then there's things around high risk behaviour, so drugs, alcohol, unprotected sex, etc., homelessness. So all kinds of stuff on there that are worth having a look at, and that's just social indicators for an individual. What they've also got on there are social indicators for communities. So if you work more at a community level, so perhaps you're an organisation that's trying to do something within a wider community setting rather than necessarily for particular individuals, so you might be trying to build social networks, improve the perception of a local area, then these are good indicators to think about for those kind of things. So people feeling engaged or involved in their community, so you might have an indicator of how well informed they feel about local affairs, if they can influence decisions that affect the local area, and then for not being engaged locally is if they've never been involved in a local organisation, they're not well informed, and they don't feel they can influence decisions. And then also something around your social networks and whether they have social support, perceptions of the local area as well. So do they feel safe and enjoy living there, and if they've been victims of crime. And so there's other things around community needs, whether they've got the access to facilities that they require in the local community as well. So again, quite useful indicators. They also then have environmental indicators. So this is about minimising the environmental impact the organisation has. And obviously the primary way most organisations would look at their environmental impact is through how they minimise their energy use. So there's something around there, and then also around transport and how much travel employees do as part of their work, and whether you've tried to minimise that. And also if you're lucky enough to go on a plane regularly for work, is trying to see how that has an environmental impact. And then recycling, how much materials you recycle. So you could look at all these kind of things as indicators to evidence that you've achieved particular outcomes around the environmental impact. So let's just close a couple of these. So then the next thing is economic indicators. So looking more specifically at individuals' economic changes, so increasing their income or their family's income, reducing household expenditure, reducing debt levels, increasing levels of savings, reducing financial exclusion, and the amount of money spent in the local community. They're all ways of looking and measuring economic outcomes. So obviously very specific indicators for particular outcomes. Let's just go back to the PowerPoints. So all that the indicator is telling you is this is how you know you've achieved a particular outcome. And because this is your first social impact report, the best thing to do is, as I said, is to have 3 to 4 different stakeholders and potentially have 2 to 3 main outcomes for each of those different stakeholders. 2, ideally, you can include one that's a quantitative one, so very much focused around something that can be measured in terms of something like perhaps people going into employment, and then a softer kind of outcome perhaps around people being more motivated, having increased self-esteem or aspirations or something. So that would be the ideal way to do it for each of your different stakeholder groups. So the next thing to think about is then, well, if these are the things you want to know for each of your different stakeholder groups, and these are the bits of data that you want to collect, so your indicators are showing you that this is what you need evidence for in order to prove that an outcome has been achieved. The next step is to think, well, what bits of information have we already got that will tell us this, or what data do we need to now start collecting in order to get this evidence of our outcomes. If you're looking to look back at what you've already achieved in 2016, or potentially go back to 2015, then what you'll need to do is obviously send out surveys to collect that data retrospectively. Alternatively, if you're setting up your systems now with a view to doing your first social impact report at the end of this year or early next year, then you can incorporate these questions and the data collection in the systems and forms and information that you already collect now, so that you are then just perhaps asking a couple of additional questions in order to collect the evidence around the outcomes, as well as all the other information that you're already collecting around your outcomes. So once you've decided what those gaps in your data are, obviously it's a case of then gathering those extra bits of information, and the processes in terms of that are, well, use as much of your existing sources of information as possible, because you don't want to be duplicating the data that you've already got. Potentially then using questionnaires to collect additional bits of information. A quick way to get it, if you do want to do a social impact report fairly soon, is to look at having a focus group with some of that particular stakeholder group to get the details of the outcomes and changes that have happened for them. Using case studies, making sure obviously you've got the baseline information, so where they're starting from, in order that you can evidence the changes. Feedback from partner organisations, which is usually quite straightforward to get, and then any financial data. So if you're working to increase the amount of money that people save, then you need to have the financial data on what those changes are for people. And then we're going to talk about this more in the next sessions, which is really around how you analyse that information. So did you achieve the outcomes that you expected? And then thinking about, well, what outcomes haven't you achieved as well as you wanted, and therefore what areas do you need to improve in order to be more consistent in terms of the outcomes that you achieve for organisations. But that's not the focus of today's sessions. Today's session was all about identifying who your key stakeholders are, making sure that you have got details of the outcomes that each of those different stakeholders desire, and then deciding how you'll know a particular outcome has been achieved. So identifying what those indicators are, and then starting to think about, well, what are your gaps in your data collection? So once you've looked at what those gaps are, that will tell you what additional surveys or information you need to collect. So hopefully it's not too complex and burdensome a process, because you're ideally not trying to make it take up too much of your time. Okay, so that's it for today's session. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you next week, where we'll be carrying on the process in terms of what we need to do next in order to get our social impact report produced.